There are Bible stories you ought to know because they speak to a bunch of different things. And sometimes, because we hear them in the order in which those things happen, sometimes we tend to dismiss them fairly quickly as it's another one of those stories. And this is a really obvious example to me of one of those occasions where we might hear the story and go, it's another one of those miracle healing stories. We've heard those before. Excellent, move on. Except there's some bits and pieces in here that kind of rather, dramatically change that view of this little story. And then it becomes quite important. Because when you think of Thanksgiving, you think of lepers. At first, I recognize that as one of those things that comes out of my mouth that I probably shouldn't have said. But it's true, though. And I think this story is why it can be true. Because the story isn't about the miracle of healing. It isn't. It's not a miracle story. It's not just a healing story. It's a story in which something absolutely extraordinary happens that doesn't happen in any other story in the Bible. Somebody thanks Jesus. That's what makes this story extraordinary. He comes back and thanks Jesus. He says thank you. He praises God and he says thank you. I'll say that a second time because that's the key. He praises God and says thank you. I'll come back to that in just a sec. But the thing that's also really interesting about this story is it has little bits and pieces in it that are worth paying attention to. For example, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he happens to be going between Samaria and Judea, right? Galilee. He's on his way to Jerusalem, but the Samaritans, as you may recall, the Samaritans are not friends of the Jews. In fact, Jews tend to think of them as their enemy. And Luke, in particular, likes to mention the Samaritans. You may recall a little story called The Parable of the Good Samaritan. And the point of that story being that it's the person that they expect least likely to stop and help the person who says, I'm just giving that away because I'm going to talk about it next week. Okay, ignore that part. I'm going to talk about the Good Samaritan next week. By the way, I'll just do a little commercial. We've been doing stories, Bible stories you ought to know, and now we're going to start looking at some of the parables of Jesus that you ought to know. And you probably do know quite a few of them, but I think they're worth taking a second look, a new look, and see if maybe there isn't something more there that speaks to us today. Kind of like this story that at first blush appears to be about how Jesus heals people. But look where he is. He's on the border between where the Jews are and where the Samaritans are. The traditional enemies, the cultural enemies. And who is it that comes back? The one he refers to, actually in this translation, refers to as a foreigner. In other translations, it's an outsider. Not one of us. Look at what they do. They don't ask to be healed. The lepers don't stop Jesus and say, please heal us. They don't say, give us some food. They say, have mercy. Almost as if they know who he is already. And then he says, in response to that, he says, go and show yourselves to the priests. Before you all start visiting me hoping to be healed, the reason Jesus says that is because in his day, if you had any kind of illness or disability, something happened to you, something unfortunate happened to you, it was because you'd done something wrong, obviously, and God was punishing you. We don't need to know what it was, we just need to know you did something wrong and you're being punished. In order to relieve you of that punishment, in order to restore you, the priests had to approve that you were in fact clean. You were in fact healed. You were able to be restored to society. It's the good old days when we had a lot of power. Anyway, But that was their understanding, wasn't it? That in order for you to be healed of that, since it was obviously it was obviously you'd sinned, obviously, and that's why that happened, you needed to be relieved of that sin. And so you had to go and see the priest. And so off they go. They follow Jesus' instructions, which is very important. It is always important to follow Jesus' instructions, except for the one guy who comes back. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, and why, for me, it becomes even more important to recognize that the story isn't really about healing or a miracle. It's about something else. There's nothing in the story that indicates the other 9 who went ahead and showed themselves to the priest. There's nothing in the story to indicate what happened to them. I mean, maybe because they didn't come back, Jesus kind of went, well, that's it for you then, and they were suddenly lepers again. Not likely, obviously. But it's also equally possible that they went and showed themselves to the priest. The priest went, wow, this is cool. You are obviously healed. Go your way and be part of society again. It's all good. It's also entirely possible they went and showed themselves to the priest, who said, no, that can't be. Obviously, you're in league with the devil, and it gets worse from there. But the version I like to believe happened is they went and showed themselves to the priest, and the priest said, this is great, you are restored. Their friends, family suddenly recognized them again, and they became part of society again, and they lived happily ever after, and because they got a second chance. And that's great. That's awesome. The one guy who came back, though, quite pointedly comes back because they recognize something has happened for which they should be thankful, and that they should recognize that and demonstrate it. And so they do. What's also interesting, though, is that they don't simply thank Jesus, they praise God and thank Jesus, as if they recognize what power actually made this happen. And it wasn't just Jesus' words. There was more there. And Jesus says, go your way, your faith has made you well. Another slight oddity of the story. Because in other stories that we hear Jesus say the words, go your way, your faith has healed you, that's when the healing happens. This is after. This is after it's happened. He's come back, he said thank you. Jesus has pointed out, quite pointedly, that one of them has come back to say thank you, and it's not who you'd expect, by the way. Kind of like the Good Samaritan parable. And then he says it. And see, I think it's because, first of all, I think it's because he recognizes that this person who's come back to say thank you isn't just coming back to say thank you because it's polite and they were brought up good. I think it's because the person recognizes that not only do they have something to be thankful for in this moment, they intend to live the rest of their life in gratitude for this moment. Quite literally, and every day I will get up and say, thank you for this new day. And that's how they intend to live their life. Which is why Jesus then says, go your way, your faith has made you well. Or whole, perhaps. So that's a thing about gratitude and living in thanksgiving every moment. Is that in that appreciation of life that you have, whatever that life is, that brings all of that I think that brings all of that love and grace that Jesus is always talking about. I think that brings that right to the front. When you live in appreciation and gratitude for all that you have, whatever it is, it means that you're willing to live out of the abundance of that. You're not constantly worried about, I don't have enough. You're not constantly worrying about whether or not you will have enough. You simply live into what you have in gratitude for your life. That gets really complicated, and I'm not suggesting by any means that it's easy, because there are certainly days that we're probably less thankful for than others. There are moments, certainly, that we're less thankful for than others. And it can be difficult to find things to be thankful for. But is the thing. There are always things to be thankful for, and it is worth making the effort. It's worth making the effort to stop and come back and say thank you and recognize the gift that you've been given with the gratitude that it deserves. I'm sure the other 9 lived fine lives. I'm sure they did very well. I want to think that. Someday, someone should write a story about what each of them then went and did with their lives. I'm sure that all turned out fine for them. But why then point out one? Why point out one? First of all, because it was the person that was least likely to have been appreciative. You know, those Samaritans. And secondly, because there is more to life when we live it with a sense of thanksgiving, when we live it with a sense of gratitude. That's why the guys earlier in the video talking about an inventory. That's the thing about an inventory, isn't it? It's not just a list. It's not just a numbering of things. You take stock of the value of it. So you don't just kind of go, well, I'm thankful for this and I'm thankful for that, because you've thought about it. Why are you thankful for that? Of what's its meaning to you? What's its purpose? What's its value to you? Particularly when we start thinking about people. It's so important to begin in gratitude and appreciation. I think that's the point of the story, is to tell a story about someone who now, and that's the beauty of, as it often is with stories of Jesus, the part that's most important is the part that doesn't get said. See, I think this story would have actually less value if the story then just went on to follow the Samaritan man living his life of thankfulness. But because it stops here with Jesus saying, go your way, your faith has made you well and whole, not just healed, but well, we get to imagine what that might mean. And that means we can imagine what it might mean in our own lives. Beginning with just the example of someone whose life was so dramatically changed and is now continues to be changed every day with gratitude.